In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest military operation in history, invading the Soviet Union across the 2,900-kilometer front, committing nearly 4 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and advanced to the outskirts of Moscow by December, leaving nearly 5 million Soviet casualties in their wake. As the Russian winter began to freeze out the invaders, the offensive that originally called for pushing as far east as Archangel stalled, and dragged on for another 2 years until the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943 delivered the decisive blow to the Axis armies that began the Soviet Union's march westwards towards Berlin. Historians have debated whether Germany's decision to invade was a grievous strategic error or one that could not be avoided given the escalating increase in military strength of the Soviets during the 1930s. But what is clear is Operation Barbarossa set in motion the military losses that sealed the fate of the Third Reich forever.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Ich bin ein Seemann.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is Alex Nicholson with Myth of the 20th Century podcast, and today I am joined by Adam Smith.
Hey, everyone.
Hank Oslo.
Hi.
Hans Lunder.
Hello.
And Nick Mason.
Hey guys, how are you?
And before we get going, I think Nick has some words he wants to say.
Yeah, I did. So, this with regards to donations. So we had someone recommend us maker support a couple months ago, and it worked out just fine. And I'm not blaming this guy for what happened, but maker support is basically a dumpster fire at the moment, and I think so everyone who has a recurring pledge to us, you need to withdraw that immediately, because I have no way of knowing if they're going to get this worked out. We have the donations made in the month of April are currently in the pocket of maker support waiting to be paid out. I'm going to make sure that gets paid out, even if, I'll just say I'm going to make sure that happens. But we did open a Patreon, which honestly we should have done beforehand. I just didn't want to give these people money. So we will have the link to that. And if people show up on Maker Support, I have a post there explaining what's going on. And had a couple of donations already to the new Patreon. There were people who donated before to Maker Support. We appreciate everybody who's donated. It means a lot, guys. But we had Ianis, Bruce, and Rhett all donated to the Patreon. So thank you very much, guys. I'm sorry that this happened with respect to Maker Support. But that's it. That's my announcement.
Okay, so we are, of course, a 20th century podcast. That's what we do. And I guess today we're just going to jump in the deep end and talk about the time that Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And I don't know, 5 or 6 million or 7 million people were killed in one very, very terrible summer. So let's just have at it. I guess to start, I would wonder if anyone has anything.
Real quick, yeah. This topic was actually proposed to us by a fellow that was going by the name of Korgoth. So if you're still listening, thanks for kind of encouraging us here. We couldn't figure out the tech side. He was originally going to come on, and then we got busy doing other things. But that was the person who requested this. So thank you in lieu of being able to actually come on. We appreciate it. So we'll try to do our best.
Yeah, so I prepared a few notes for that conversation just in advance of it, and it really is something that's worth discussing, because I mean, how can you talk about the 20th century without eventually talking about the Second World War, which we've done a little bit of in the past. But what I want to suggest we do is we talk about the magnitudes in Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And if we look at the magnitude of troops, tanks involved, and the buildup and the state of readiness of the various units involved, that we can gain a sort of like distance from this war, and maybe start to look at it from a kind of a boring almost, or an objective standpoint. So with that in mind, I guess I will just read off a few interesting numbers that I think should be brought to bear here. So the Germans are invading actually with a larger force than the Soviet Union has in place at this time. The Germans and their allies, so the allies, Romania, Finland, I believe Hungary and Italy. I don't remember exactly how the proportions were, but
do you want to give that intro, or do you want me to kind of talk about why this was happening to begin with? Do you want to do that later?
Well, I'm assuming that people know about the Second World War, if you're listening to our podcast. But maybe if you want to say something, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think there's a little more detail than just the Second World War. I watched a history documentary. This particular event was very pivotal in deciding the direction of the war. It was the largest land battle in probably history, definitely of the war. And the decision to even do it was very controversial in Germany. And it was debated in the Soviet Union as well as to what the likelihood of it was. So I think it serves discussing the decision-making process behind this.
The Soviets had war-gamed it almost perfectly, actually. Years before, certain Soviet officers had.
Well, actually what happened was there was a guy that Zhukov replaced who actually lost the war game. And so what the war game revealed was that the German army was currently able to beat the current Soviet defenses. But we can get into that once we start talking about the actual battle. But what Germany was doing and the Soviet Union was doing was they were allies from, I think it was it 1939 when they
signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the Soviets get possession of the Ukrainian and the Belarusian populated parts of the Polish state, and then the Germans do most of the legwork in crushing Poland.
Yeah, the other part of that was that the Soviets were sending large amounts of raw materials to the Germans in exchange for manufactured goods. And the secret protocol, actually, before the invasion of Poland, was that they would have these separate spheres of influence. And then when Germany invaded Poland, 2 weeks later, the Russians invaded from the east. And that actually took more than half of the country. But the economic trade term component of that pact was actually very important, because that was part of the reason why the uneasy peace existed, because they sort of needed each other. On the Soviet side, the Soviets were trying to get the precision machinery from the Germans so that they could build up their industrial base, and the Germans, being somewhat resource poor, they needed the raw materials from Russia to build up their war machine. And so they kind of were frenemies, to use the stupid modern term, but there was a lot of distrust between them. And with the expansion of their respective spheres of influence over Eastern Europe, their borders literally were touching each other, essentially. And so these two empires were right at each other's noses, and it was very uneasy. And the decision on the German side to break the peace was extremely debated, and it was Hitler's ultimate decision to do it, because the fear was that the Soviets were going to invade eventually, and the signs were there after they'd invaded Finland, and then they had taken over the Baltic states and started a lot of oppressive behavior that we've already talked about with our Lithuania
chopped
episode.
off a chunk of Romania.
Well, and German intelligence. German
Romania.
intelligence was picking up major war preparations.
Well, they weren't war preparing; they were doing a military buildup. So
yeah, they'd put 160 divisions on the Western Front, of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
And
they were definitely building their military up. I mean, because, like, of course they would. They're next to Nazi Germany. Why wouldn't they do that?
Yeah, I think I would like to, at some point, I would like to do a dedicated episode on Suvorov's thesis that found an icebreaker and chief culprit. But there is the popular mythology that either one, Stalin mistakenly trusted Hitler, or two, he feared Hitler. And Suvorov, who was a former Russian intelligence, Soviet era, he put forward the thesis that it was Stalin was preparing for this for quite a while. But
Stalin didn't trust anyone. I mean, he killed.
Yeah, but this is in
people.
popular mythology of the shit tier history. That Stalin mistakenly trusted Hitler and was the victim of Germany.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Soviet apologia that, even from the time, the propaganda was shifting on a dime between not Arlo Guthrie, Guthrie's father. This machine kills fascists.
Woody Guthrie.
Was it Woody Guthrie?
Yes, it was Woody Guthrie.
I thought he was the son.
No, that's Arlo. Arlo was his. Yes, Woody Guthrie was This Machine Kills Fascists.
Yeah, so I mean, immediately you can look up old recordings of his pro-Stalin songs immediately after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then of course as soon as the invasion occurs, it's the fascist capitalist pigs in Germany oppressing the poor loving people of the
and that stuff was all directed, as we've dealt with in other episodes, by the Popular Front and Munzenberg's outfit. It same with Pete Seeger, and you're right, exactly, Hank. The propaganda was shifting on a dime.
Yeah, I also want to point out that after the German invasion of Poland and the 2 week later Soviet invasion, the French and the British declare war on Germany, but not the Soviets. And so for anyone who says this war is about protecting Poland is not reading the cards right.
No. You have to remember that the parts of Poland that they took over were substantially, or in many cases majority, Belarusian or Ukrainian. That was their claim. They had a legitimate claim to those lands, even though there was also a Polish population present.
I'm not sure we're speaking about the same thing here. What my point is,
but
the French and the British
we're talking about the split
basically
of
trying
Poland.
to contain the Germans. They were not willing to go to war over just the rights of the Polish people, regardless of who's invading it.
Oh yeah, sure. They are definitely the British specifically are, or elements within the British leadership have been angling for 70 years at this point to destroy German unity. They don't like the idea that Germany is a unified, more or less unified.
And it was also a superior economic competitor than the British Empire system, which was mercantilist and not very competitive, frankly, at that point at least.
Yeah, I mean, just think about the history of British cars versus German cars, just to have some idea of how well their manufacturing industry is operating. British can't hold a candle to Germany.
Yeah, don't tell that to Jeremy Clarkson, though.
To who? Oh, yeah, that guy from the car show.
Your guy.
Well, their cars are fun. The British Roadsters.
Yeah, I actually like British cars. They're more exciting actually than German cars, in my opinion. But they don't have.
Never know what it's gonna do.
Exactly. Yeah. They have more flair, but they don't have the sort of consistency of a German product. So that's the problem.
But I thought we agreed that the British are the bad guys here.
Oh, we do agree.
Oh, definitely.
That's the point. That's the main point.
Churchill is like the primary monster of the Second World War.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be doing a Churchill episode, friends.
So obviously, I am the Mongolian apologia person, pro-Russian in this case, but trying to be objective, and I think probably.
But we're here to talk about numbers, right, Alex?
These two. I want to bring up something. These two powers were already fighting a proxy war against each other in both Spain and Finland at this point. You had German expeditionary units fighting against Soviet troops inside of Finland, while
in the Winter War.
In the Talvisota. And
I think that the Germans deployed there after the Finns basically fought them to kind of like a draw.
No, there were German troops. There were German and Swedish troops operating covertly inside of Finland.
Just a few thousand guys.
The Winter War was only for 4
It was
months.
just a token
It wasn't on
force.
the same scale as the Spanish intervention,
No.
but you
Right.
still had like proxies shooting at each other.
The Swedes moved the better part of their force to Finland. They just gave the Finns their air force, even though I think the Swedes had an obligation to declare war on the Soviet Union. They abrogated that.
Right, and up to this point, the German military perception of the Soviets was that of general incompetence. They sort of regarded Soviet generals as either about ready to be purged at any moment, so not worth investigating or looking into, or just generally incompetent sort of apparatchiks of Stalin at the time. So leading up to this invasion, especially with the Soviet catastrophes within the Winter War, the German High Command was under this impression that, all we have to do is invade very quickly, and this will work the same way that our invasion plans for France are going. And the only real contention we're going to have to deal with are the British and possibly the Americans, but that France and the Soviet Union will fall very easily because the French were very obviously to everyone just a mess, politically and militarily speaking at the time. And the Soviets' only demonstration of military strength up to this point was against the Polish in a very early war in the 20s, and against
the Vistula campaign where they lost.
Right, and against the Finns, and it was like a 4-to-1 casualty ratio against nascent Finland using troops on reindeers and skis to destroy Soviet tank columns.
Yeah, they did beat the Finns though. They did take an enormous proportion of Finland, including a massive nickel deposit.
Right. So, but despite that, the German High Command is essentially saying, well, if the Finns are able to inflict that kind of damage in a short amount of time, imagine what we can do with a fully industrialized military and real competent leadership. So,
and better terrain.
Right. So, leading up to this, Hitler basically says, we're going to kick the door in and take over everything from Astrakhan to Archangel, the A to A line. And this was late December. This is after the Winter War sort of is wrapped up, and the Soviet Union is looking like just a complete mess. And he issues Directive 21, and the German High Command starts preparing for what constitutes at the time the largest land invasion ever conducted in military history. So about 80% of the German army is mobilized to invade the Soviet Union. So this is like 17 panzer divisions with 3,400 tanks, and then they had 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft, and as Alex noted, like over 3.7 or 3.8 million soldiers.
Yeah, so I have 3.8 million.
Just for a point of comparison, like the entire current United States Army is 18 divisions.
Wow,
that's 10 active duty and the remainder National Guard. I mean, so you're talking about literally just enormous volumes here.
Right.
And the Germans have better tanks in the beginning, so they have more men deployed, and of course they're deploying a lot of the Soviets have tons of guys in the Far East and in Central Asia as well.
Right, because the Soviets are in the middle of.
Let me throw out some numbers. I'll just finish this one thought, okay? So they have 3,700 tanks on the German side, but 800 to 1,000 of those are Panzer III, and about 900 are Panzer IV. So those are rather modern medium tanks. The Soviets have 21,000 light tanks, but these are basically glorified, like armored riding mowers, essentially. I mean, I've seen these old 1930s Soviet tanks. They're not something that you would ever want to get inside of or fight with. They only have 700 heavy tanks. These are like KV-1 tanks, which is really quite a good tank. And then they have about 900 medium tanks, a few of which are going to be the T-34.
The T-34 at the start of the battle, they only had about 1,200 of those, and they had those KV whatevers in much larger quantities, but they clearly were just not able to fight.
Yeah, I wonder if they had 1,200, but the T-34s...
They had just been introduced, and I don't think they were really ready, and the tank crews probably didn't know how to drive them very well.
All their units were in a state of incompletion. or not all of them, but some huge fraction of their units were not ready to go. So they would have tank units that might have some KV-1s and some T-34s in them, but they'd also have a lot of obsolete tanks, and they wouldn't have like the mechanics integrated into the unit yet that would maintain the tanks, and they didn't have the guys who would drive trucks under somewhat dangerous conditions to refuel the tanks. So they didn't have effective armored units. They didn't have effective units in general, because all of these units, you're talking 4,000 to 10,000 men in a division, I think, maybe more. Does that sound like plausible numbers?
Right.
Yeah, usually it's like pegged at around 10,000, but you have different classes of division that have different staff levels. Like an artillery division has much less.
Well,
and these are complicated organizations. They have specialized subunits, and these subunits were not in general filled out simply because the Soviet military was in a state of rearmament and not ready to fight.
And part of that, a big part of that was because of Stalin. And in 1937, he had executed, I'll give you the hard numbers here. In 1937, he had executed all 11 deputy commissars for defense, 3 out of 5 field marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, tens of thousands of middle-ranking and junior officers, and many more were sent to labor camps and replaced with basically his friends who didn't really know what they were doing. And then he later had to call up a lot of those people he'd sent out to the labor camps that he hadn't killed, basically to fight once the Barbarossa campaign started.
Konstantin Rokossovsky, the guy that I use as my avatar, he had his fingernails ripped off by Stalin's goons, and he had his teeth smashed out of his skull. So he wore steel dentures. There's a few photos of him smiling with his steel dentures. So he was horribly mutilated, by the Stalin regime. And then they thought him out and brought him out to run the war in Smolensk as the Germans were crossing the Belarusian frontier into Russia itself.
And when you talk about
that's so fucking metal.
He's an extremely metal dude.
He's
when
a
you
great
talk
man.
about the organizational complexity of just that volume of people, like think about if you work in a large company, think about what a shit show it tends to be on the inside. And like a really large company, like Google. Google has about something like 70 or 80,000 employees. And it's an organizational nightmare. Now, you imagine that's only like 7 divisions, and we're talking about like 150 or so on the side. So it's just the mass of people, the difficulty of conveying instructions or information from one part of the apparatus to the other is just astonishing.
And the Soviets especially were technologically very far behind their opposition, and they had a huge limitation in their radio systems, and it got to the point where I think only one commander per I guess like a tank group or something could have a radio. Nobody else could, and that's partly
this is part of that story about unpreparedness. So they did have high technologies, but it wasn't deployed or produced in an even way.
Yeah, I think it's partly intentional too, because they don't want a lot of information getting out to potential enemies within. I think that was, I'm assuming here that's partly intentional.
So you wait and deploy your radio crews, like really are going to go on the offensive.
Because I mean, the way these guys were used was just it was merciless. I mean, they would just dispose of huge numbers of men, and I have a feeling that information should not be widely spread too much, and so they probably kept a lot of the communication systems very under close guard, so to speak. I don't know.
I wonder.
It's also
you would
probably
also
a
want your guys
issue.
to train hardware.
Yeah, the Soviets kind of had a very. There's a really good book by that Viktor Surov guy, not specifically about World War II, but it touches on a lot of the organizational aspects of the Soviet Army. It's called just Inside the Soviet Army. You can find it online. And there's some really fascinating nuggets in there about like organizational ticks, like how they deployed reserves, how they see a lot of weird calibers in Soviet artillery, where like it's not a 100 millimeter tank shell; it's like 107 millimeter, just to make it a little bit more idiot proof, so that if you have conscripts screaming over your one radio that you need more shells, you're more likely to get the right thing. There's a lot of good nuggets in there.
So they would say 107 so that if you didn't hear clearly, you'd have a chance to recognize the item from both a 1 and a 7.
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, it was even more idiot proof than that. You would ask for like a 7 millimeter or something. Like you would just take like, give me a number 7. And they would understand what that's meant by that. But we'll probably get into this more when we get into the kind of course of the war. But the fact that they basically had huge numbers of shadow divisions is how Suvorov refers to them. But basically, reserves that were sort of mirroring your operational units in terms of their kind of role, and also in terms of their your kind of use, even potentially of the same equipment. Be like, oh well, that division is dead, but we still have a lot of their equipment. So, like, here, Slavoj, like, take this Mosin. You're the division now.
So they'd have guys behind the lines LARPing to be another division. I mean, they could move quickly.
Essentially, yeah.
Well, that's certainly something the Russians were able to do, was resupply and replenish their divisions as they were burned out and destroyed. Because of course the Germans are capturing enormous formations. At one point they capture an army of 600,000 men in the Ukraine. They encircle them, but the Soviet army is able to, the Red Army is able to replace 5 million men who were lost, 3 million of them captured in this first campaign, this Barbarossa campaign from June to December.
Yeah, right. And there was a general lag in resupplying these men at times because Stalin was busy sort of fending off Japanese land incursions into Manchuria and sort of the southern region of eastern Russia. The Russian Far East was under major threat of invasion by the Japanese at that point. So he had spread out most of his troops throughout the Soviet Union. Some of them were tasked with building industry in the Urals or on the other side of the Ural in anticipation of losing the industrial heartland in the West. And he also had, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men, either mobilized and active or semi-active and sort of just stationed in the Far East, because at this point it was looking like China was going to collapse. It didn't really look like either the Kuomintang or Mao could fend off the Japanese, and there was very little hope coming for the Soviets.
Yeah, a lot of these guys that are dispersed across the Soviet Union are not veteran army dudes or
right.
Air Force guys. So here's an interesting set of numbers. So Soviet forces grew from 1.6 million in early 39 to 5.7 million on the eve of Barbarossa. So these guys are not veteran by any means. This is a build-up curve. So in that time interval, so you're talking, some guys have 1 year of experience, 6 months of experience. They've not been well trained and they've not been drilled, and a lot of them, they grew up on the streets during the Russian Revolution. They're not used to operating, let's say, inside of a structure like.
Real quick about Han's last point about the East Asian deployments, they were able to get 1,000 tanks actually by December to move towards the defense of Moscow in 1940, I guess, when they got intelligence that the Japanese were not going to launch an invasion.
Right. There's the whole issue of moving from the Stalin line from the how did it go? Yeah, the Stalin line was abandoned and they moved to the Molotov line in May 41. So that's a further westward line.
Yeah. So. It's like your names are in the wrong order. Like, you really don't want to be the guy who's like, yeah, I think we need to retreat from the Stalin line.
One point about the Stalin line, it was actually set up, I think, at the original USSR borders, but after they had taken all of these Baltic states over and part of Poland,
Belarus and Ukraine,
yeah.
They took Lvov or
the
Lviv,
Warsaw Pact stuff, basically. Yeah. Once that had been accomplished, I guess after this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed, the Stalin line was actually well behind the frontier. And so what Stalin was doing was he was actually moving his troops forward from those fortifications on the Stalin line. And this was actually against a lot of objections from whoever was left in his officer corps, and he ignored them. And this is actually one of the reasons why the Germans were able to do as well as they did, is because those fortifications were not available to those troops. And so basically the Germans just captured a lot of them or killed them, and they didn't have their defenses at the Stalin line. And eventually that line was broken as well. But if they had been behind their fortifications, they would have had a better chance.
So this invasion essentially begins with, what is it, June 13th, I believe. This thing officially kicks off.
That sounds about right.
And there's three.
It's June 22nd, 3:15 a.m.
Yep.
Okay. So
didn't they play lists, or Les Préludes? I don't know how to say it, but
I hope so.
They played. I think they did play that over the radio, which is a very Hitler move, because he was, really into this classical music.
Yeah. Total Hitler move.
So
he was friends with Wagner.
It was the Apocalypse Now, Ride of the Valkyries.
For the era, it really was.
Yeah. There's three primary German army units, and I should say this is actually more general German coalition. There's Finnish troops, there's Italians, there's Slovaks, there's Hungarians, Romanians, so on.
Lots of Romanians, yeah.
Rainbow coalition.
A coalition of the willing splits into three groups with German military command. You have Field Marshal Lieb, Army Group North, Field Marshal Bach was Army Group Center, and Army Group South was General Rundstedt. Now, Army Group North was going to plunge through the Baltic, take Leningrad, and then isolate arguably the cultural center of the Soviet Union away from the industrial heartland, and isolate the intelligentsia and as many of the military high command as they could, and completely destroy Soviet ability to project into the Baltics and retake any of that territory.
Yeah, and that's what Manstein was as well, who would later become the boss of the war, basically.
Army Group Center was to basically do exactly what you think, drive through the center of this line all the way straight to Moscow. So they were going to take Smolensk, every city along the way. They anticipated that this would actually be where the majority of Soviet troops would be utilized, because it was very clear once they figured, okay, once we take Smolensk, the Soviet high command is going to realize this massive army group, huge panzer divisions, is coming right from Moscow, heartland around it. And then Army Group South was...
That's where Guderian was deployed as well, at the center.
Yeah. And then Army Group South was anticipated as going to have the least resistance. But this was arguably the most important maneuver, was taking what was Ukraine, the Donbass, moving to the Caucasus and into the Pontic Steppe. Now, this was done for a very specific reason, as this region had an immense amount of the Soviet natural gas, mineral, and petroleum deposits.
The oil's down in Azerbaijan, so if you can cut the Caucasus off sufficiently, deprive them of the oil.
And there was the idea that if we cut off the Soviets from the Black Sea, and if we sweep up to Archangel after taking Leningrad, we're going to remove the ability of the British, the Americans, basically anyone from moving aid into the Soviet Union to fend off this invasion. Because again, the Germans have committed 80% of their military and associated forces to this battle. They know that if this doesn't work, then they've sacrificed a lot of time and energy instead of maybe taking out Britain right away. Which
Archangel was a stretch goal. Let's just be clear. That was about as far as I think they had ever planned to go, and they never got to it. But what they were
there's some it's not really clear, and it's part of the reason people contend that the whole thing kind of fell apart at the end. It was never really clear what the German high command wanted to do after they developed this Archangel to Astrakhan line. There was some
the idea was basically, and this is all sort of fluctuating because when war starts, I mean, you throw your plan away because it's usually not relevant anymore. You still need a plan. I think it was Eisenhower said, always start with a plan, but then throw it away as soon as you begin. But I mean, I think the initial idea, I mean, again, stretch goal, if you can actually get that far, was the Soviets would basically be withdrawing behind that line, and their industrial base was also at the foot of the Urals, and so that would be then within the reach of the German Luftwaffe, which could then destroy whatever's left of the war-making ability of the Soviets. But again, they never really even got to that point. They weren't able to do it. And then Hitler kept changing things. They were originally going to go for Moscow, and then they switched to this, we need to demolish their economy. So then they went over to Leningrad, and then they started veering south, and they kind of avoided Moscow. And then they went back to Moscow again. It was a mess. I mean, things changed a lot.
Well, it was an enormous undertaking. I mean,
right.
So here's some more statistics for you. The Germans assumed, and I stole a lot of these statistics from a German fellow on YouTube, History Visualized, I think his name is. A good channel. But the Germans assumed that the Soviets had 150 divisions, just of all different types, and they could raise another 50 divisions. But they, in reality, raised in the course of the war 800 divisions. So the Germans are fighting. They're doing a really,
how many
great job.
How many soldiers per division? Just so we can get that.
Maybe 10,000.
Yeah, I mean, all of these are going to be under strength once the war actually starts. So call it a mean of
7
or 8,000.
Yeah.
So 7,
and then,
8
some are going to be really big.
Might have ended up being liquidated. So when they, quote unquote, raise a division, it's okay, well, these 3 are shattered, so we're going to combine that with this conscripts. We have a quote unquote division.
Yes, but anyway, every time a Soviet division is captured or destroyed or knocked down to a level of functionality that's basically useless, they're replacing it with 1 or 2 divisions in this first early period, or even more divisions. And the Germans end up losing 1 million soldiers for this campaign. And it's apparent by 3 months in, when they've lost 650, 700,000 men, that it's way, way worse than they planned, and that they simply don't have the men in the field armed with expensively produced hardware and trained and experienced to really prosecute this war.
Right. One of the
I mean, 1 million men. Imagine replacing 1 million men participated in the Poland campaign and the France campaign and Norway. You can't easily replace soldiers with that kind of experience.
Yeah, one of the major problems early on is that these panzer divisions are very quickly outpacing the infantry, and there was this idea that the Soviet military, and once we encircle these cities, and the Soviet population is going to simply give up, or they're going to defect, or they're going to see just how bad the Bolsheviks are once we arrive. And in places like Ukraine and in the Donbass and in parts of the Baltic areas where there had always been sort of a German influence, this was somewhat true. But once they moved past that into the real kind of Eastern Slav heartland and the real Russian heartland, that was just not a shared sentiment. People there were really not happy that Germans were invading.
Well, they were significantly less happy after the fucking Einsatzgruppen, or however you pronounce that, showed up and started raising their local villages to the ground.
Right.
There's a significant case to be made. I mean, you have to remember that throughout the 1930s, the main strategic threat that the USSR was planning for was that Poland, like weak, flat, just fought a war themselves, Poland, was going to grab large chunks of the Polish and Ukrainian speaking Polish, like east or western parts of Ukraine and parts of Belarus, because like regions had immense levels of famine. We talked about this during the Holodomor. You had refugees that were threatening to overwhelm the local areas. I mean, it's really like, had they pursued a more conciliatory approach immediately, you probably would have actually had significant local population support. But you can't do that if you're immediately laying down the jackboot and destroying villages, taking hostages, executing civilians of just the general civilian population.
I agree with everything you said. They didn't do it immediately, though. I think what was happening was that they had, and the Soviets had some stay-behind partisans that were basically picking off German officers, and then the officers were like, well, we can't stand for this. And then they ended up doing all this scorched earth stuff, which alienated the rest of the population.
Right, which is like classic, like, counterinsurgency, no. Like, I mean, regardless, even
losing
if that,
of hearts and minds.
Well, even if, and, you know, on the right, or especially in NRX, you have the straw man of, well, you know, if you just apply enough force, then the problem goes away. And that might actually be true in a long enough time frame. But the primary goal of the German invasion was to make time. Like, you have to go as quickly as possible to encircle these large troop formations. You're not trying to, like, wage a war of attrition. You're trying to get to a place as quickly as possible while maintaining your supply line. So frankly, it doesn't matter if a couple of officers in the rear get capped. Like, if your response to that is to make your supply line untenable by really pissing off the local population, then you made a major blunder. Like, that's just a loss that you have to up front if you're trying to rapidly advance like that.
They had ideological constraints. You know, they were not ideologically capable of not treating the East Slavs like animals, you know? Like, if they rolled in with Orthodox icons on their Panzer IVs and given out food, you know, maybe it would have worked differently, but that's not how the leadership prosecuted the war. Even if the soldiers, I think, tended to get along with the Ukrainians. Let me share an anecdote. I know of a certain case where a Ukrainian village had an individual who in the 1970s was named Nazi because he was the bastard of a Wehrmacht soldier. But he was a valued member of the community, so there was perhaps some, you know, they didn't completely hate these German.
Leon de Grelle had he participated. They had joint services between Catholics and Orthodox on the Eastern Front at one point.
Yeah, but let's not pretend for a moment that the German leadership totally intended to destroy these people and completely dispossess them of their agricultural lands. You know, like that.
Well, I was bolstering your point that there was a discrepancy between the elements of the leadership and what a lot of the soldiers were doing.
Yeah, certainly. This is always the case. There's actually a bit of a Vietnam kind of anti-authoritarianism that pops up among the German soldiers if you read memoirs of them, like Schwarze Edelweiss, Black Edelweiss, that book.
Well, German soldiers were actually even trained in like third generation warfare, where you would have scenarios where disobeying orders was part of winning the war game.
So immediately after rolling in, you know, it doesn't take long for one statistic is 1,800, like a day or two, 1,800 Soviet aircraft to be destroyed. And, you know, within, let's say, a few weeks, you have the complete collapse of really important cities like Brest-Litovsk, Bialystok, Volkovysk, Gorodichi, and Minsk are just totally taken. There's no Soviet troops.
That's Belarus. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're already plunging through. That's a mixture and center group plunging into the heartland. And at this
Smolensk
point,
is the I think they execute the leader who failed to defend Smolensk sufficiently, put Rokossovsky in charge there. He is unable to pull it off, but Smolensk is symbolically, okay, this shit is real. We're in Russia now.
Right. So that's
the gates of Russia.
Right. So the Germans crush the Smolensk defense on July 16th. So within less than a month this beginning, they have really, you're right, they have entered the Russian heartland. Now, the Soviets understand that there is a third group, Army Group South, with Rundstedt as leader, moving towards the Black Sea and, more importantly, moving towards their oil supply. This is where they station the majority of. So a lot of the early failings of the Soviets against the German mobilization efforts are due to a very simple reason, and that's because the Soviets have decided the oil is more important than the farmland at this point. And they're able to very quickly move some of their more important industrial centers to the Urals at a short notice. And in March of this year, the Americans had passed the Lend-Lease Act, and they were already moving manufactured goods into the Soviet Union through Archangel, which had yet to be taken.
I have some numbers I'd like to
dollars
read.
At work.
I have some numbers I'd like to read about that.
Wait, real quick before you do that, we did talk about in some of our episodes we did on Soviet subversion, Harry Hopkins, but Harry Hopkins was, of course, instrumental in Lend-Lease, and it is this podcaster's opinion that he was, in fact, a full-blown Soviet asset.
Yeah, so what they ended up doing was, I mean, the American economy was probably the largest in the world at that point. And
yes, it was.
It was completely out of range of any weapons. There were no ICBMs. I mean, the submarines could barely get out there, and the ships, certainly you could see them coming, and aircraft could obviously not hit America. So what the United States was able to do was basically, and this is, again, another cringe term, it was called the Arsenal of Democracy, and this stuff was ironically given to the Soviets.
What a perfect name, though.
Yeah, it's a good name. It's good propaganda, but
now that we all know what democracy really is.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
In the context of the Syrian conflict.
So just to give you some hard numbers on what was given to the Russians this includes the UK, but we'll just assume that this is somewhat minor compared to the American contribution, and this is coming from the Allied Battle for Bolshevism. I'll put a link to that. And I quote, "A small example of what the capitalists sent free of charge to ensure the continuance of the Bolshevik grip on Russia and Eastern Europe. 14,795 aircraft, 7,056 tanks, 51,503 jeeps, 457 military vehicles, so 500,000 military vehicles, 8,218 field artillery, 1,981 locomotives, 11,155 freight cars. This rail stock was also used to transport millions of Russians and other unfortunates to Stalin's gulag. 131,633 machine guns, 105 submarine hunters, 7,784 ship engines, 197 torpedo boats. Besides, much more can be listed here. 90 cargo freighters were left with Stalin's Bolshevik Russia. There were 4,478,000 tons of food, machines, and equipment. $1 billion worth $1 billion. Non-ferrous metals, 802,000 tons. Petroleum products, 670,000 tons. Chemicals, 842,000 tons. Cotton, 106 million tons, if you can believe that. Leather, 49,000 tons, and tires, 3,786,000 tons.
That's huge. Tires is huge because they don't have a ready supply of in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not too many rubber plantations in
I think the
Siberia.
main thing that they sent them was the really important thing was the food and the trucks. I don't know if the Katyusha rocket system certainly looks like it's
500,000 vehicles. I mean, that's just astonishing. You know?
And they use those for the Katyusha
fun
plan.
fact, Chef Boyardee, a.k.a. Chef, I think is the original name. He got his start as a gigantic military contractor in the Second World War. He was a real dude. The factory was running 24/7 from like 1941 until the end of the war, most of which was going to feed Pavlov his SpaghettiOs.
Well, I mean, when I hear this, I mean, I understand that people are not big fans of the Soviet Union, but like, these people are like, they're suffering torments that are impossible for us
their
to
military
imagine.
losses alone were 8 million. So
Yeah.
the human toll was enormous.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes more of a problem once you're talking about later in the war. Like once you start to get to like 1944 and you're sending over just, shitloads of machine goods. It's like, okay, I mean,
yeah, okay.
Our greatest ally, like, it's, basically a steel forge in a box. Here you go.
Yeah.
I'm sure that'll, get us to Berlin a little bit faster. Like, at some point it becomes a giveaway, but, I mean, honestly, I'd much rather send materiel than people. If you've made kind of the strategic decision that you want this side of the war to win, then shit. Like here's some Mosins, go crazy.
Who was it? Was it who's the big gun manufacturer? Remington out of Connecticut?
Winchester made Mosins in the
First World War
for Soviet production.
Really?
They also there's a whole big autism thing. There was also like a bunch of 1895 lever actions that were chambered in the Mosin round that
wow.
I don't think that they ever made their way over there because they had the revolution or only part of
the Tsarist government bought loads and loads of Mosins, this whatever they were using in World War I, that version of the Mosin from I guess maybe it's Winchester. Is that right, Hank?
I think it's Winchester.
Yeah, so they made loads of those and then they just stayed at the and you can buy them. They're highly collectible because they have the Tsarist eagle stamped on them instead of Soviet symbol, the star.
Oh, I guess it was Westinghouse and Remington. Winchester was the Winchester built something.
So it was Remington.
I
they nearly went bankrupt from it, from the failure of the Tsar to pay. Actually, so here's one more statistic. This is my final set of statistics that I want to share. So on 20th June 1941. There are 136,000 German divisions, quotation marks, suited for all operations. They're ready to roll. And then there's an assortment of other divisions that are in lower states of readiness. There's 4 other states of readiness that decline in quality. And then in March 1942 is they're beginning the spring offensive, which results in the Stalingrad episode. There are 8 divisions that are in the highest readiness state. So 136 to 8. So they're basically, their army is completely, the eyes have been bloodied on the Wehrmacht and the SS formations by March 42, by the end of this episode, this Barbarossa campaign.
A couple of things I wanted to point out about the logistics. One of the reasons the German march basically ran into big trouble was obviously the winter. I mean, this had gotten Napoleon into deep trouble. Back in, was it 1812 when he launched his campaign?
Yes.
And the winter and the fall actually were sort of two problems. The German supply lines were extremely far away from this origin of the goods that were resupplying the army. And one of the things that compounded this was that the Soviet rail lines were on a different gauge than the Western European standard, which was 4 feet 8.5 inches. The Soviet gauge was 5 feet across. So that's basically how far across the tracks are from each other. And this was actually on purpose. This was actually a defensive measure by the communist government to make any invader not able to use their rolling stock on the Soviet tracks. So
what about the width of the iron? Was that the same?
I couldn't tell you, but my source in this was just an article that was pointing out this one particular fact. And so what effectively that did was the German army had to move via truck and horse. Actually, there were almost 1 million horses employed, despite what the propaganda videos might show you from the German side. They employed 675,000 horses to move their infantry and carts and whatnot. And then the trucks that were able to move, and the problem started actually in the fall. The rains that were coming down were making the roads just almost unusable for regular wheeled vehicles, and they could only get as far as maybe 2 miles a day. The only vehicles that were able to move were the tracked vehicles, the tanks and whatnot, but those aren't really logistics vehicles. They're military vehicles. They're not carrying goods for other parts of the army, and so their ability to move the equipment and the food and water and fuel was very limited by the weather. And also by the aforementioned rail system being unusable. And then actually when the winter started, this actually helped the Germans somewhat just at the beginning, though, because the ground started to freeze, so they could actually drive quickly again. So that's when the Moscow siege really started picking up. But then when the real winter started hitting in December, temperatures dropped to 40 below. And the Germans, even though Germany's a cold place, they had never experienced anything like this, and they were dying. They lost half their army around Moscow due to disease and frostbite. So this is one of the reasons why the Russians just have a huge defensive advantage. They have this ridiculously large landmass that is just hard to invade and keep supplied for an invading army, and they also have this really dangerous weather that they can use to their advantage.
Yes, but I mean, and I don't want to downplay the role of the winter, but the losses. I also want to give the Russians some credit, like the losses that the Germans had endured 3 months in. So what's that? June, July, August, September. By September, October, they've lost 700,000 men as well. So that had to play a big role too.
Yeah, by October, let's say the Southern Army had reached Kharkov in Ukraine. They had laid siege.
Yeah, far Ukraine,
Kharkiv.
Right in the border with Russia.
Yeah, so they had already besieged Odessa. They were besieging Kiev. They were moving into Kharkiv, but
they've got Sevastopol. Under siege, which Sevastopol and Odessa both held out for a long time.
Right, and at this point too, in September, they had moved into Leningrad, or they had actually surrounded Leningrad. Now, they were never able to actually go into the city and engage in, sort of a full-on fight the way that they had intended to, for a couple of reasons. Again, there was this problem of their supply lines were stretching too far, and they were trying to do too many things. By this point, they had already kind of given up on invading Moscow. They had decided that the Army Center Group was going nowhere. That trying to hit Moscow while being unable to take Leningrad and struggling to take Ukraine and struggling to root out Soviet resistance and the Soviet armor in the Southern campaign meant that Moscow was just not feasible. They were about 200 miles outside of Moscow when they gave up. And they directed most of those forces to the north to help take Leningrad, and they had Finnish soldiers coming down from the Karelian Isthmus. The problem being that the best Finnish military at that point, the best of the Finnish military, was sort of logistically trapped in Finland. Finland, was not a very developed country at this point to begin with, and had most of its infrastructure destroyed or bombed out by the Soviets. So the Finnish were not able to maneuver most of their crack troops into this battle for Leningrad, and they didn't have many to begin with.
Yeah, their guys are better off using Alko. Alko is the national liquor monopoly in Finland, and they converted all their vodka production to making Molotov cocktails. So they're much better hiding in the woods with Molotov cocktails, blowing up, obsolete Soviet tanks.
Yeah,
than deploying to take a major city, where you need heavy artillery and you need all this heavy to take a city like Leningrad.
Right, and at this point, the Third Reich also has had to embed parts of their military in Greece and Yugoslavia and Norway and Denmark. They're continuing, fighting the French resistance. They are not getting real support from Franco to help seal off, a British landing.
They kept 200,000 men in Norway.
Yeah, they're trying to prepare. They're trying to prepare for an invasion of England while they're still handling this attempted invasion of the Soviet Union. There's just way too much going on. They overextended very rapidly, and they were mistaking, the strategic retreats of all their enemies as a sign that they were sort of destined to just overwhelm them. At this point, the Soviet supply lines are so short, they're able to take a combination of American and British goods and their own manufacturing base and just pump it at massive levels towards the Ostfront. And the Germans are simply unable to supply their troops as quickly. They're unable to get food to these guys. They're unable to replace their tanks quick enough. And they just become overwhelmed. They've completely stretched themselves thin. And I don't think that they really anticipated the amount of resistance that they were going to face.
I have a question which I wish I had the answer to right now, but how were the Lend-Lease goods being actually imported into Russia, given that the Western...
Through Archangel.
Archangelisk, I think they took them through that port.
That's why,
British could take them up there.
Yeah.
They were simply
so
unable
they were sent
to
over
take...
the Atlantic to Britain first, and then sent up through the Baltic kind of area.
Through the
Arctic. Meanwhile,
Arctic,
the Germans are desperately trying to sink all these convoys. Let's not forget that the U.S. had basically been fighting a naval war with Germany since about 1940. It had armed merchant ships before Pearl Harbor even, and they were shooting at German U-boats on the open sea, Atlantic Ocean. So they were kind of engaged, and as the war heated up and you had actual navies fighting, the German submarine warfare became far more aggressive, and they were losing just enormous amounts of convoys before they figured out how to structure them appropriately, did a bunch of very leading operations research into, so is it better to have a lot of small ships or a few huge mega convoys? How do we structure our destroyers? Do we try to save all of the ships, or do we try to throw some to the wolves? That could be a whole show in and of itself.
This is the Liberty ship story where they're bringing out welding, a big way to make these cheap ships. They spam the Krauts, basically. If you want to watch a great movie on this, Das Boot is certainly the best submarine movie.
That's one of the greatest films ever, dude.
Yeah.
I would recommend
Peterson is just a great movie.
People check out the 4-hour long original cut.
Yeah, the longer the better.
I've seen the really long. They're like there's some absurd version I've seen that's really long.
I believe it was only released on TV or something, but yeah, it is 4 hours long.
Yeah,
that's your finishing move. You invite your dates up, watch Das Boot.
Works every time.
200 meters, or whatever. When they're diving really deep and the ship's buckling.
It's not the only rivet that's busting loose.
By October, basically the Southern campaign is turning into a huge flop. And the Northern campaign isn't working. Not enough Finnish troops, and the supply lines aren't strong enough, and there's a lag in getting the infantry there in time to really seal off Leningrad and siege it effectively. So Hitler decides that he is going to sort of assume control over his military, and he begins sort of distrusting his generals, doesn't think that they're doing an appropriate job. So he decides unilaterally that Operation Typhoon is going to be undertaken on October 2nd. And after sort of saying that we're going to avoid taking Moscow for now, we're going to focus on taking the Caucasus and Ukraine, and we're going to focus on taking Leningrad and moving to Archangel as quickly as possible. They decide to then pincer move from both campaigns down into Moscow and reinforce the old center campaign, which at that point had sort of been half abandoned. This was just a massive mistake. At this point, this whole operation is sort of failing. All three campaigns are failing, but this is just a huge mistake, where he pulls troops away from these two operations that are struggling. But if he had pressed on, might have succeeded. He might have succeeded in taking the Caucasus, and he might have succeeded in.
You think he would have succeeded in taking the Caucasus?
He might have, and he certainly would have succeeded in destroying Leningrad.
So it's worth talking about some of the internal Soviet situations around this time, because they're seriously considering at all points at what point they should maybe sue for peace. And they're also, I guess you could say, they're concerned that Stalin might be concerned that they're planning on deposing Stalin and suing for peace on that basis. So there's a lot of kind of internal machinations as everybody goes out of their way to signal, no, we're really all on the same team. Like, here, Comrade Stalin, let's declare you the supreme marshal of the Soviet Union. Let's make you the defense minister as well. They're really sort of worried that this is going to affect the internal stability of the regime. And there's also kind of the hope on the German side that at some point the Russians actually will sue for peace, especially as things start to kind of not go as well for them. There's never kind of concrete negotiations, but there's this kind of glimmer of hope on both sides that, like, well, maybe we can come to an understanding, because the stakes just kind of getting higher and higher all through the end of 1942 or so.
It doesn't take long for the high command of the Third Reich to determine that this just isn't doable. Like, that this invasion of this new plan is just a failure. But they go along with that anyways. A lot of them are just sort of trying to fulfill the wishes of Führer. And they make a massive strategic error in assuming that the Red Army is not going to
They're always thinking the Red Army is just one more week away. They're gonna give up. They're gonna
right, and they also keep making a strategic error that the Red Army isn't going to know what the Germans are doing, like as if the Red Army wasn't capable of determining a very obvious military maneuvers. So the Red
there's
Army,
kind of the ego trip that, like, everything had been actually working according to plan. Like, that, like, a half dozen times prior to Barbarossa, like, they had made these grand gambles and they had worked more or less perfectly in every instance.
Right, and several, during these, after the decision to kind of abandon the center campaign, and they just keep pressing on with North and South, the Red Army had launched several counterattacks which failed. The German high command, the German military command, knew what they were doing, and they were able to repel counterattack after counterattack after counterattack, and they never ceded any. They just it slowed down, but they were still gaining territory, and they were just demolishing huge numbers of Soviet troops, or just taking them prisoner and sending them to camps, wiping out thousands of units of Soviet armor every month or every week. It's just
Yeah, a lot of that being the really crappy lawnmower armor that I referenced.
Right. So they had not really run into the T-34s too much yet.
Well, T-34s and KV-1s would run amok because they had these things and they didn't have like really good. They didn't have them integrated into armored divisions, or armored brigades really, but they did have them. And sometimes a few Russian cowboys would just drive a T-34 through German infantry formations or panzer formations even, and no one could stop them because they're the only gun that worked was the artillery gun, the 88 millimeter artillery gun. That was the only way that you could reliably stop these just futuristic tanks that the Soviets had. So they could harass them, they could tie them up. I mean, this is why the Germans. This is the whole thesis here, is that the Germans, yeah, they're making impressive gains, but they're also bleeding at a horrible pace. Every step they take, they're losing men. And these indecisive raids by T-34s were part of that. You know, they bled the German. The Germans had to take losses to take these formations out.
Right. So at this point, the ground is starting to get a little cold. Things are starting to get wet and muddy. But again, you know, this stuff about the Soviet winter defeated the German military is sort of, it's obviously more complicated. And the Soviet winter was probably close to defeating the Soviets just as much as the Germans. This winter was terrible by all accounts, and the Soviets were...
I don't think as much. Probably it didn't help them too much. But in a way, if you're playing chess and it's sort of like, if you're slightly ahead, you don't mind trading pieces because then your sort of proportionate ratio advantage actually grows. And so I think because they were also losing fewer numbers, I would assume, than the Germans to the cold, because it's their country and they're used to it, it would work to their advantage. So I will make that
German
assertion.
Gun oil, the Ballistol gun oil, it's actually, you can still buy this gun oil. It's what Hickok 45s use it.
Good shit.
This gun oil will not work, you know, below some cold temperature that happens in Russia in December. So the German guns, in many cases, would not cycle because the oil had lost its oil properties in the cold temperature. Viscosity, yeah.
So that's part of it, but this winter was particularly wet and destructive towards any ground maneuvers. And the Soviets were obviously struggling themselves to reinforce their lines because they couldn't get any of these, you know, newly manufactured tank divisions to the front line sometimes through the, you know, trying to get them from the Urals to Moscow or to Leningrad. So this winter is close to defeating both sides, but the real key was that the Luftwaffe had been sort of depleted at this point. The Germans were not able to utilize their air force as effectively as they did in other regions, and certainly at the beginning of this conflict. And they were not able to utilize their core strategy of bomb Soviet military positions, move in quickly as possible, and take out and just encircle and pincer move any sort of Soviet troops that couldn't fire their guns. Now, things were looking very bad for the Soviets even after the Germans made this sort of weird move to reinforce the center group. The combination of Luftwaffe depletion and inability to operate effectively, and the winter halted the Soviet advance. Or, I'm sorry, halted the German advance. And at this point, you know, the Germans become drawn out into a sprawling campaign across the east in very poor conditions, far away from their supply lines. You have men freezing to death, unable to eat, unable to fire their weapons. And it's a slow burn of all of your high agency and high intellect military officers and soldiers dying.
These are the dudes who volunteered for this.
Right. These are
they
the guys
were thinking they were going on this great Homeric conquest to, you know, get land and all these things, but it didn't work out that way.
No.
So I wonder what else. I mean, the campaign's really over by December 41. Or if there's anything else we need to address.
Nope. I mean, the you're right. It's basically over by December. It's just completely collapsed. And Leon deGrelle talked about this. Nick can kind of back me up on this, but that their retreat from the Ostfront, was this really insane expedition that they go on, where I think deGrelle compares it at one point to running from the Mongol. It's like once the Soviet military sort of shaken off the winter, and the German high command had basically said we need to retreat back to Minsk and some of these other regions. These guys were trying to move back across the steppe, in the same pace that they had come in, with all of the amenities and armor and everything that they had sort of taken for granted. And you have Soviet troops riding on horses, or sort of patching cars together, or patching motorcycles together using speed.
They also have the 80,000 T-34s they were able to make.
Right. So now, it's just a complete collapse. Like they couldn't, the Germans couldn't even mount a proper strategic retreat at this point. They had totally imploded, and all of their sort of, I guess you could say, sort of officer corps, real strong officer contingent.
You're talking about after Stalingrad, right?
Right. Those guys are all dead. So you have, the guys on the ground that could direct troops more efficiently and could make, small decisions here and there that could improve the efficiency of a strategic retreat, are all dead. They're all dead.
And deGrelle talks about tank battalions going on basically final suicide missions to buy time for infantry to escape, and he gives very moving descriptions about this.
Yeah, at this point, it's essentially a reverse blitzkrieg at this point against a retreating German military. And the German fortifications in cities like Minsk are then on the receiving end of something that was very akin to the German invasion of Minsk, and they're just totally crushed, and they're taken prisoner in huge numbers. We talked about this in the Adenauer episode. A lot of these German POWs are sent to go rebuild parts of the Soviet Union that they had just finished destroying in some cases.
Yeah, the Soviets, I mean, their wrath was incredibly mechanized.
Yeah.
At a certain point, they became so efficient that they could produce just endless volumes of really pretty sophisticated military hardware, even if the execution of the design was somewhat crude. The T-34 was in some ways sophisticated, but in other ways the build quality is not that great. I've seen quite a few of them in person. And they're also making like Joseph Stalin tanks, which were these enormous late war tanks, and huge artillery pieces, and the numbers of artillery that they were able to bring to bear on targets were, I think they've never been paralleled. It's certainly not.
Right. So, one of the main, I guess you could say, failures of, both, and I'm counting them as separate entities, both the political high command of, Adolf Hitler and the military German high command, was that they couldn't agree on a real strategy. Now, everyone at some points, at different points, agreed that Moscow should be taken. The difference being that the German military thought Moscow should have been taken and razed to the ground immediately. The Germans thought, if we completely raze Moscow, if we put every member of the Politburo's head on a pike, this whole charade of the Soviet Union is going to fall apart really quick. Instead, other members of the military, and certainly the political apparatus, wanted to take Leningrad, wanted to link up with the Finns in the north, and wanted to take out Ukraine, and wanted to try and maneuver to grab the industrial supplies of Ukraine as well as the oil in the Caucasus as fast as possible. The military thought...
None of these things, though, that's the thesis that at least I'm trying to push, is that none of these plans that they imagined that they could do were viable.
Right.
Okay, wow, you want to take Moscow. That's a great plan. How do you get to Moscow? They didn't have the capacity to get to Moscow. They didn't have the capacity
they got within 7 miles of it. They got damn near close to doing it. So it is interesting to think about if they had concentrated on it more, what would have happened. It may be that they would have ended up like Napoleon, who did take Moscow and still losing. We don't really know, but I think it's not an outside chance that they could have taken it.
They could have done maybe one of these big objectives, but the picture that I draw, or whatever, the conclusion I draw from looking at the loss numbers that they endured in this 5-month campaign is that they just didn't have enough men and they didn't have enough firepower for the.
They didn't have enough. In many cases, pincer movements where they would surround huge numbers of Soviet men. They didn't work long term, and the Soviets would just break out and run back deeper into the Soviet Union. And
the Soviet soldiers were good soldiers. I mean, they were tougher than any soldiers in the world. Maybe they weren't the best soldiers. The Germans had the best soldiers, but the Soviet soldiers could endure way more punishment than I think the Germans imagined was possible. And so some of the high Soviet loss numbers are easily explained by the ill state of preparedness at the beginning of the war, and then the fact that they're fighting an offensive war crossing rivers for the last 2.5 years of the thing. 2 years.
Yeah. And the last minute sort of Operation Typhoon, at that point, I think that the German military was saying, we had a chance to take Moscow. We really shouldn't even focus on it. We've committed huge numbers of troops to this southern campaign, and you want to give up on it now? Like, we don't really advise that, but they went, the political high command ordered that Moscow be taken as sort of almost a domestic appeal to the Germans that, things were going well in the Ostfront, and things were very much not going well. It was already sort of collapsing at that point.
Во многих местах и подвергли бомбежке со своих самолетов наши города.